9 experienced hikers leave in the dead of winter. They pitch their tent on a barren slope. Sometime during the night, something happens. They cut their way out from the inside. They flee into the freezing dark, barefoot, underdressed, and they never return. In late January 1959, a group of 9 hikers led by Igor Dyatlov set out on a ski expedition in the northern Ural Mountains. Their destination, a remote peak known as Otterton. Their last camp was established on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl, a name that translates roughly to Mountain of the Dead. When the group failed to return, a search began. Days later, rescuers found the tent. The tent was still standing, but partially collapsed. It had been cut open from the inside. Inside were their belongings: boots, coats, supplies. Outside, a trail of footprints led away from the camp, some barefoot, some in socks. The tracks continued for several hundred meters toward a forest edge. The first 2 bodies were found near a cedar tree. They were barefoot, dressed only in underwear. Nearby, remnants of a small fire. 3 more bodies were discovered between the tree and the tent, positioned as if attempting to return. Months later, the remaining 4 were found in a ravine, buried under snow. Some of the victims had severe internal injuries. 1 had a fractured skull, 2 had multiple rib fractures. 1 victim was missing their tongue. Clothing from some bodies showed traces of radiation. Several garments appeared to have been removed and worn by others. The final report stated the hikers died of hypothermia and fatal injuries. The case was closed. What happens next depends on how you interpret what you're about to hear.
The most grounded explanation is a localized slab avalanche, or a credible fear of one. A small, delayed release could have struck the tent and forced immediate evacuation.
The tent was cut into the slope, so katabatic winds could easily deposit a dense slab over a buried weak layer of depth hoar. A delayed release hours later would deliver enough compressive force to explain the internal thoracic and cranial injuries without external marks.
A localized slab explains the internal trauma without external bruising, but it creates a logistical contradiction. The tent was barely displaced while the ribs beneath it were crushed.
And it accounts for the sequence that follows. A sudden physical threat forces them out, then exposure and injury create a cascade they cannot reverse.
The sequence is coherent under that model, but coherence isn't the same as completeness. It accounts for what happened without explaining the decisions that followed.
Their movement pattern also fits. They head toward the tree line, likely for shelter, then split into groups, some maintaining a fire, others attempting to return.
The footprints show an initial unified, directed descent toward the trees, rather than chaotic scattering, which fits a purposeful withdrawal from a perceived immediate hazard on the slope.
This orderly descent is the pivot point. It indicates they were still functionally operational and making tactical choices long after the initial panic event.
Purposeful movement doesn't rule out an ongoing perceived threat. It just means they weren't disoriented. They knew where they were going.
Hypothermia is the least contested part of this. The question isn't how they died. It's why they were in the position to die that way.
The more severe injuries can also fit within this framework. Snow compression or impact against terrain could produce high internal force without visible external damage.
A small slab could pack enough localized pressure against the tent floor and underlying skis to cause those fractures. And its limited size, plus 26 days of wind, drifting, and partial melt, would leave no obvious runout or debris pile by the time searchers arrived.
We are essentially asking a very small amount of snow to provide a lethal amount of kinetic force, while leaving almost no forensic trace of its passage.
That's the problem. If the avalanche model holds, you have one event, If the injuries happened later, you need two. The simpler explanation starts to split.
A natural explanation that accounts for some of the physical evidence without requiring external actors. But remember, the behavioral evidence is physical evidence too, and it doesn't fit the model as cleanly.
It explains more than it leaves open.
Yet it fails to reconcile the behavioral gap between tactical retreat and total survival failure.
That's the actual anomaly. Not that they died, but that people organized enough to build a fire never reassessed a 1.5-kilometer walk back to survival.
That's the central tension. If the immediate threat had passed, returning to the tent should have been the priority.
The persistent failure to retrieve gear, despite rational actions at the fire and short distance, suggests either rapidly deteriorating visibility and wind chill made the slope feel impassable, or early hypothermia was already impairing judgment by the time they reached the trees.
If the fear of the slope was that absolute, we have to assume the environmental trigger was perceived as an active, persistent threat rather than a one-time event.
The mismatch is physical. The tent was upright. The force needed for those injuries would have left more trace than a standing tent and scattered belongings.
These weren't novices. They understood exactly what exposure would do, which makes the failure to return not just tragic, but structurally strange.
Injury could explain part of it. But the most severely injured were found farther away, in the ravine.
These weren't novices. They understood exactly what exposure would do, which makes the failure to return not just tragic, but structurally strange.
The timeline breaks if the injuries are at the tent. You cannot march 1.5 kilometers with a shattered skull and flailed chest.
It doesn't need to be a major slide, but the force required for those injuries is major. The scene doesn't reflect that force.
The absence of documented debris means the avalanche model rests largely on what the injuries imply, not what the scene confirmed.
Though later models argue a small slab wouldn't leave obvious traces after 26 days of wind and snowfall.
Exactly. The 2020 to 2021 slab avalanche simulations match the tent geometry, wind patterns, and injury distribution closely enough that the absence of dramatic debris is expected rather than contradictory.
While a secondary event in the ravine is statistically less clean, it is the only way to align the high-impact trauma with the locations where the bodies were recovered.
They moved with crushed ribs and fractured skulls. That level of injury and mobility is difficult to reconcile. If they made it to the ravine, the trauma likely happened there.
The body distribution suggests the situation evolved over hours, which means whatever drove them from the tent also held them away from it across an extended period.
Which suggests the situation evolved over time, not just a single moment of crisis.
The body distribution reflects a single initiating event followed by phased failure, flight to trees, fire attempt, abortive uphill returns, then descent to the ravine seeking lower wind shelter, ending in exposure and secondary trauma.
We are looking for a constraint that is powerful enough to override the survival instinct of 9 experts, yet invisible to the search parties 26 days later.
The avalanche explains the exit. It doesn't explain why 9 people still capable of organized thought never collectively decided the tent was safer than freezing.
Which leaves the sequence intact.
Then, we're explaining behavior with an invisible threat. The physical evidence stops anchoring the sequence.
The avalanche still explains the injuries best. Dense snow compression can produce that kind of internal trauma without external wounds.
The mismatch is physical. The force required and the scene left behind don't align.
It doesn't need to be a major slide. A small, localized slab could create pressure without widespread debris.
You're describing a slab that was powerful enough to fracture skulls and ribs, but left no documented debris and didn't destroy the tent. That combination of conditions is doing a lot of work for one model.
The mechanical problem is that the high-impact trauma is geographically isolated to the ravine, not the tent site.
The severe ravine injuries, multiple rib fractures, and skull trauma on Dubinana, Zolotaryov, and Thibaut Brignol likely resulted from secondary events after the initial flight, such as falls into the 4-meter-deep ravine streambed or localized snow collapse there, rather than at the tent, as that degree of damage would have immobilized anyone immediately.
People with fractured ribs can sometimes move short distances, but the most severely injured were found furthest from the tent. The geography runs the wrong direction for that explanation.
If they reached the ravine, the trauma likely happened there. The alternative requires them to travel with injuries that should have immobilized them.
That introduces a second major event. The model becomes less unified.
Splitting the trauma into a secondary event in the ravine is messier for the narrative, but it aligns better with the physiological limits of the hikers.
The initial trigger remains the small slab avalanche at the tent. The cut platform trapped wind-blown snow into a dense cohesive slab that released delayed force equivalent to a car crash on the bodies pinned against skis and tent floor, prompting the slash exit.
The trigger gets explained and re-explained, but whatever kept 9 people from returning over several hours is the actual problem, and the avalanche model has nothing to say about that.
Purposeful movement doesn't rule out a perceived threat. It just means they weren't disoriented. They knew where they were going.
Yet they made decisions that led directly to exposure. That suggests either misjudgment or constraint.
We have to distinguish between a perceived threat and a physical one. The hikers clearly believed the tent was a death trap long after the initial event.
No physical traces of a continuing threat exist post-evacuation, but worsening katabatic winds, near zero visibility in blowing snow, and advancing hypothermia could have made the 1.5 kilometers uphill return feel impossible or too risky for recurrence.
The trigger gets explained and re-explained, but whatever kept 9 people from returning over several hours is the actual problem, and the avalanche model has nothing to say about that.
Now, we're explaining behavior with an invisible cause. The physical evidence stops anchoring the sequence.
And where the evidence becomes harder to anchor.
The anomaly is the logic gap, where the hiker's expert survival training was rendered useless by a variable we haven't identified.
That's the most honest thing anyone has said. We're now describing a threat with no physical signature, which is either the real answer or the point where the investigation stops being rigorous.
The trigger is well defined by the slab model. Tent geometry, plus wind loading, plus compression mechanics matching autopsies. But the post-evacuation sequence remains unclear due to how quickly rational actions gave way to fatal exposure.
The trigger is defined. The decisions after it are not. That's where the model loses coherence.
We are looking for a singular influence that can force a tactical retreat while simultaneously making a return impossible.
There's another element that doesn't sit cleanly. Reports of glowing orbs in the sky were logged by multiple observers in the region. If the hikers saw something overhead they couldn't explain, it changes what safe and dangerous meant to them in that moment.
The reported orange spheres in the Ivdel region in late January to early February 1959 match documented Soviet missile test failures, R-7 ICBM, launches from Baikonur or Plesetsk, visible over wide areas of the Urals. They were unrelated to the hikers' ground-level events.
Even if unrelated to the ground events, An anomalous visual stimulus could affect threat perception. It's a variable, not a cause.
But there's no direct evidence linking those lights to the incident itself. They don't explain the physical sequence on the ground.
While lights in the sky don't cause crushed ribs, they can fundamentally alter the risk-reward calculus of a group already pushed to the edge by a localized disaster.
They understood they were dying outside. That's not a subtle calculation. So whatever made the tent feel more dangerous than exposure wasn't a momentary panic. It was a sustained conviction.
The threshold for abandoning insulated shelter in minus 25 degrees Celsius wind chill was extraordinarily high. Only a sudden, credible physical threat, slab impact, pressure, noise, inside the tent itself explains cutting out rather than using the entrance.
Exactly. The danger was severe enough to justify leaving, but not severe enough to justify never returning, even after reaching shelter.
They built a fire, they organized, they attempted a return.
The establishment of a fire suggests a period of relative lucidity where they had the chance to realize that the mountain wasn't actively collapsing.
All 9 of them, across hours, with at least one attempted return. The conditions alone don't reliably produce that outcome for an entire group of experienced people.
Progressive hypothermia, combined with near-zero visibility from katabatic winds and blowing snow, plus terrain obstacles and early exhaustion, made the 1.5-kilometer uphill return effectively impossible despite initial rational efforts.
Or something blocked return physically, or something blocked it psychologically. The evidence doesn't tell us which.
There's also the radiation detail, limited but present on specific clothing.
The radiation is a classic forensic outlier. It is likely a red herring, but its presence ensures the case can never be closed with a purely natural explanation.
The soft tissue loss is probably decomposition, but it's distributed unevenly across bodies recovered under comparable conditions, and that unevenness has never been specifically accounted for.
Trace radiation traces to thorium lantern mantles, common in Soviet expedition gear, or minor fallout from the 1957 Kishtim disaster on one hiker's clothing. Postmortem soft tissue loss, tongue, eyes, is typical scavenging and decomposition in a thawing stream environment.
Individually, each has a plausible explanation. Collectively, they resist one.
The pattern isn't one anomaly.
It is a series of explained phenomena that, when layered together, create a scenario that contradicts standard human survival behavior.
The problem isn't that each detail is unexplained. It's that the explanations don't share a common cause, which means either we're missing something central or this was never a single event.
The avalanche trigger remains the most parsimonious explanation for the exit and primary injuries. The stacking minor details, lights, radiation, tissue, are individually accounted for and do not require a unified alternative cause.
Which shifts the problem from what happened to whether the physical event and the human response were driven by the same thing.
The avalanche model still explains the most.
The slab avalanche model accounts for the trigger, delayed release on the cut platform, the compression injuries, force against skis and tent floor, and the panicked /evacuation in darkness.
It explains the departure, but the data fails to account for the total absence of a successful return to a functional base camp.
The evacuation is the easy part. The 1.5 kilometers they never crossed back over is where the model runs out.
The trigger explains the exit. It does not explain the permanent choice not to return.
And that gap keeps widening.
Worsening katabatic wind, blowing snow reducing visibility to near zero, combined with rapidly advancing hypothermia and exhaustion, could have made the short uphill return feel physically or perceptually impossible.
We can't blame standard environmental conditions for the failure of a group that was still capable of complex fire building and shelter crafting.
There's documented evidence of at least one return attempt, which means the barrier wasn't confusion about where the tent was.
They organized, they attempted, and still no one made it back. That's not random failure. It's a consistent outcome.
Even before the worst injuries.
The partial return attempts show initial competence, but progressive core temperature drop and cognitive impairment from hypothermia likely eroded decision-making before severe secondary injuries occurred.
Or the variables of the threat evolved from a sudden physical event into a sustained psychological or environmental barrier.
Not a momentary fear, something that held across hours, across attempted action, across the full cognitive capacity of 9 people who were still reasoning clearly enough to build a fire.
That's the threshold. They chose exposure over return. Something held that choice in place.
Stronger than survival instinct.
The unresolved core is why a demonstrated rational response, fire, organization, uphill probe, never overcame the threshold to retrieve life-saving gear from 1.5 kilometers away.
Nature rarely produces a scenario that induces a total, collective abandonment of the only available life support system.
Cold and terrain degrade capacity incrementally. They don't simultaneously eliminate the survival instinct in an entire group that is still organized and still moving.
For all 9, over hours, in a group still thinking clearly enough to build a fire. That's the pattern that doesn't resolve.
Not for that long.
Physical prevention and sustained false belief produce the same outcome here, and the evidence doesn't clearly distinguish between them. That's the actual unresolved question.
Or they believed the slope remained too dangerous to reapproach, whether from fear of recurrence, obscured conditions, or early hypothermia distorting risk judgment.
We are left to choose between an physical impossibility we can't see or a psychological terror we can't prove.
The physical threat may have been momentary. The constraint on their behavior was not.
If the danger wasn't the cold,
Then the tent was the source of it, and they chose freezing over returning to it. And we still don't know what made that the rational calculation.
It begins with something simple. A slope, a tent, a decision to cut into the snow and settle in for the night. Nothing about it suggests what follows. A small shift, maybe, a sound, pressure. Enough to make 9 experienced hikers choose the outside over shelter. Not just briefly, but completely. Barefoot, underdressed, into minus 30 degrees Celsius darkness. They move with purpose, not scattered, not lost. They build a fire, they organize, they try to go back, and then they don't. That's where the line breaks, because everything after that still looks human. Effort, cooperation, survival instinct. But something interrupts the one decision that matters most. Return to the tent. Not once, not successfully. Not even when they're close. The injuries can be explained. The cold can be explained. Even the missing pieces, the radiation, the soft tissue, the lights in the sky, can each be placed into a box. But the behavior doesn't sit inside any of them. They didn't act like people who were simply escaping danger. They acted like people who believed the danger was still there, and never stopped believing it. So the question shifts, not what forced them out, but what made them stay away.